Hello.
Hi.
You may have noticed in some of our prior series we had several of the subjects set up as Watchtower myths. The ones we've got to so far enumerated were the Door-to-Door series and the Cross, which I don't think we put a number to, but is nevertheless in its PDF document a myth of the Watchtower. And the other one was Apostate Christendom, so I think we enumerated that number too.
Yeah.
So in the list we now add God's organization. I believe if there's one that dominates the others, it's got to be this one. You start with the notion that God has an organization, and then you work back from that to God needs an organization, which in effect makes God dependent upon this thing, this human thing. And I think we need to address the meaning of the concept of organization in the context of the biblical revelation. It's really not organization that God has. It's an organism. Just as in the New Testament, the church is a body of Christ, starting from that very organic analogy. So the nation that he develops in the rest of the Old Testament depends upon the notion that you start with a human being, and a human being naturally becomes, well, a family, and then beyond a family, an extended family, and then a clan, and then a tribe, and then a nation. So in the Bible, the notion of nation is organic.
Yeah.
It's not the modern nation state, just as organization is a kind of a pseudo-organism.
Right.
It's a substitute for the fact we don't have natural connections with people anymore in the way we've developed this world.
Right.
So we have to start really not with the Noah concept. Somehow the Watchtower manages to read God's organization right back before Abraham, and Noah and his family become God's organization. Well,
Yeah.
you can see the ridiculousness of that. But when it gets to Israel, developed from Abraham, then it becomes more like we think of as a structured thing we might call organization. But
it started also as a family.
it starts as a family. So we have to go back to the beginning of that process to see how God builds his nation out of one man, and realize what a contrast that sets up with the way the Watchtower thinks of God working today.
And people do want to go back to that because we have that 6 degrees of separation. People really do like the idea of how are we connected to one another.
Yeah, so let's read from Genesis 12, 1-3, where you have 7 promises attached to what we call the Abrahamic or Abrahamic covenant, because at this point he's still called Abraham.
Okay. Genesis 12, 1-3. And Jehovah proceeded to say to Abraham, Go your way out of your country and from your relatives and from the house of your father to the country that I shall show you. And I shall make a great nation out of you, and I shall bless you, and I will make your name great, and prove yourself a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and him that calls down evil upon you I shall curse. And all the families of the ground will certainly bless themselves by means of you.
So the calling of an individual, Abraham, at this point, from his connections, and to start a system of blessing that will eventually bless all families. It goes from the family of Abraham to all families of the earth. In effect, it leaps over the 6 degrees of separation. So I don't know if you're familiar with that concept, but a generation ago there was a very successful stage play called 6 Degrees of Separation, which was later made into a movie, which familiarized the public with this idea that all of us are connected to everybody else by 6 degrees in some way, or less.
Right.
And in the Bible, you do follow that logic, because you realize here's an individual man, Abraham. He will have a family. His house, as it were, will become an extended family, his immediate relatives. Beyond that, there's the clan. Then there's the tribe. Then there's the nation, which will come ultimately from the tribes.
Right.
And beyond that, there's the nations. So in the Bible, at least, nations are organically connected by flesh, by blood. And that normal way of thinking of nations has now been replaced just in the last 200 years, interestingly, since Russell and the growth of the cults, that has been replaced in the West anyway by something called a nation state, which is a rather artificial organizational concept, which is replacing the organic concept you see here.
Yeah, because of just the way the world is now. People not developing even towns the same way, where it used to be most of the people in the town had the same last name, or they all belonged to one another.
Yeah.
They were extended families.
Natural connections, natural affections, as Paul thinks of the last days as characterized by lack of natural affection. Well, what choice do we have in the way we've structured the world? So in here, it's not explained how this blessing can go from one man who doesn't even have any children at this point,
right, to all the world, to all nations.
So Abraham is kind of left to scramble, and he does.
Yes, he tries to work it out his own way, but God has other plans.
God hasn't yet revealed what the plan is, and I think if you go through the rest of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, you see better how that plan is going to work out. So in the next segment, we'll talk about what Deuteronomy reveals. Before Moses dies, Deuteronomy reveals what God's mind is as to how the blessing will go from one man to all families of the earth.
Right.